June 3rd, 1980, 2:26 in the morning. Deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, the world's most expensive basement is awake. The air tastes recycled, like coins and old coffee. Fluorescent light flattens the color out of everyone's face. The consoles hum, steady as a refrigerator, steady as a heartbeat that refuses to admit it's nervous. And a watch officer leans closer to his screen. He doesn't blink. On the main display, lines of red text begin to populate, like the opening credits of a movie no one wants to see. The characters are simple, numbers and letters, but they carry the kind of meaning that makes hands sweat. The summary reads, multiple inbound missiles. Source, integrated. Confidence high, NHE looks to his right, to the lieutenant who has a pencil tucked behind one ear and a laminated card in his hand. They have drilled this card into muscle memory, into sleep, into superstition. Step 1. Validate the source. Step 2. Cross-check the ballistic missile radar sites. Step 3. Notify the National Military Command Center. Step 4. Coordinate with Strategic Air Command. Step 5. Adjust the nation's posture if ordered. It's a ladder of verbs. Climb it too fast, and you can fall off the world. NHE asks the question that should save everyone's life. Do the radars see anything? Across the loop, cold northern voices answer one by one. The massive early warning radars in Greenland, in Alaska, in the United Kingdom report clean scopes, no tracks, no returns. If missiles have actually risen from silos across the Soviet North, they haven't climbed high enough for Earth's curve to let radio waves touch them yet. Geometry has its own schedule. It refuses to be rushed by fear. In still, the satellite picture insists. The Defense Support Program birds, sitting high over the equator and staring across the edge of the planet, are designed to catch the hot breath of a rocket motor punching through the lid of a silo. To infrared eyes, a launch is a small sun, and suns are hard to argue with. End phones in this room do not ring politely, they present themselves. One line to the National Military Command Center, one line to Strategic Air Command, another to the alternate command center. Each handset looks heavier than it has any right to be. The officer does not touch them yet. He wants the Earth to speak before he lets space shout over it. NHE calls the NMCC with a voice that has been trained to carry stress without spilling it. Cheyenne Mountain shows multiple inbound tracks on the integrated feed. Space-based sensors report launch signatures. Ground radars are negative at this time. We are holding in validation and waiting for cross-confirmation. The answer is short and civilian. Copy. Keep us on a short leash. Somewhere in Washington, lights are turning on and shoes are finding feet. NHE calls Strategic Air Command. The voice from Nebraska sounds like it was taught to stay warm even when the weather can't. Go, the voice says. He gives the same careful sentence. Integrated alarm. Space suggests launches. Ground radars negative. Holding in validation. Understood, SAC replies. We're moving pieces to cockpits. Standing by. Moving pieces to cockpits means the ladders roll, the checklist binders open, the crews put their legs into flight suits. Not engines. Not yet. The red numerals on the screen multiply. The integrated summary declares a massive launch environment. The lieutenant's pencil breaks, and he apologizes to the wood. A printer begins to chatter, shredding perforations and spitting paper that smells like hot dust. The officer circles the word growth on his notepad, and later will wonder why he chose to circle a verb. NHE remembers last year's SCAR, a training tape that was accidentally threaded into the real information path, a simulation wearing a real badge. That false alarm was supposed to be impossible now. The rules were rewritten. Test feeds were segregated and marked. The word exercise was nailed to anything that wasn't sky. But rules, like circuits, are only as sturdy as the weakest solder. NHE orders the loop widened. Bring Canada on. Bring the UK on. The Canadians sound tired and kind, the way good neighbors sound at 3 in the morning. They're clean. The British site is clean. The northern radars remain clean. The curve of the Earth is a gatekeeper with no sense of drama. They are minutes away from the horizon where physics will give them either confirmation or forgiveness. NHE looks around the room and sees small human things. A cup with a coffee ring that fits perfectly over yesterday's ring, a chair that complains softly when a captain shifts his weight, a status light that flashes once out of turn and then behaves, like a nervous recruit catching himself before he salutes the wrong person. The officer is grateful for these civilian gestures from inanimate objects. They keep him from sprinting in place. NHE tells his team, quiet but absolute. No code words, no adjectives, numbers and nouns only. It's not poetry, it's survival. A single wrong adjective can pull a lever you can't push back. End time thins. 10 minutes to the radar horizon. Then 9. Then 8.5. Each minute feels wider than it should be. Wide enough to hold all the possibilities a strategist fears and a father refuses to imagine. Strategic Air Command checks in again, and he repeats the same careful sentence. Maintain posture. Not engines. He writes 2 words on his pad, small enough to be private. Not engines. NTHE lieutenant asks, softer than the air, "Does this look like a decapitation strike to you?" The officer hates that his first answer is a feeling. The numbers do not grow the way doctrine says they should if the enemy intends to blind and behead command. The numbers grow like something else, like a machine with its foot caught on a rug, repeating the same motion because motion is what it knows. He tells the lieutenant the truth he can say out loud. We treat it as real until the planet tells us otherwise. 3 minutes to horizon, 2 minutes. He speaks to the radars like they're runners about to cross a line. Timestamps, azimuths, elevations, track quality if anything appears. No adjectives. The radars answer with the crisp monotony of people who know that monotony is a form of mercy. Negative, negative, negative. He calls the NMCC at 2 minutes and then at 1. He puts the phone down and imagines he can hear, through the wire, the different shape of breathing in rooms where civilians wear urgency like a borrowed coat. He calls Strategic Air Command again, and the word copy arrives sounding like gratitude wearing discipline. And then horizon passes. Ground radars still show nothing. The officer logs it like a judge signing a decision. Horizon crossed, no ground picture, maintain validation, withhold notification, rationale, dual confirmation not achieved. In a world that worships speed, restraint is an act of strength. NTHE screen keeps insisting. The integrated summary keeps performing. He lets it. He speaks into the net and tells everyone to hold. His voice does not climb. It sinks, and the room follows the depth. NHE looks at the laminated communications discipline card and reads the sentence in red he didn't write but would have. Never speculate on open lines. Do not launder intuition as fact. The sentence is bossy and correct. It has saved lives before. It saves one now, even if no one in this building gets to know whose NHE begins the incident entry properly. Times. Counts. Actions. Rationale. He prints. He doesn't flourish. He underlines the word withhold in a way the paper can barely feel. Pride is dangerous in an hour like this. It leaks into verbs. Better to stay with nouns. NHE calls each radar site again, because rituals are the stitches that keep a night from coming apart. Negative, negative, negative. Canada is still clean. The United Kingdom is still clean. The northern fans are still clean. He thanks each voice with a tone that promises to remember it. NTHE integrated display, like a troupe performing to a leaving audience, begins to lose its conviction. The numerals thin, the vectors fade, the printer slows. The lieutenant threads the paper strips into a neat ribbon and clips it to the board where evidence goes to live like butterflies, too light for the weight it carries. NHE tells the National Military Command Center that they assess a suspected false positive pending analysis. He tells Strategic Air Command to maintain posture and not change a thing. He tells his own team they're going to write this down like grown-ups, and then he allows himself to ask, for the first time in the hour, the question that has been pacing around the room since the first red line appeared. Why did it lie? NHE doesn't answer it. He is not an engineer. He is the gate. He writes a heading on his pad, cause candidates, and leaves the space blank. Not because he lacks a guess, but because guesses do not belong in logs. NHE sits back a fraction of an inch and lets his spine remember what chairs are for. The air conditioner rinses the room with the same indifferent air it gave them an hour ago. The clock keeps dragging second hands through time the way it always has. The building returns to its hum. The phones become objects again. The integrated display becomes a screen again. NTHE World, for the moment, has chosen to continue. But the story isn't over, because when the analysis team start pulling apart what happened in those minutes, they discover that the weakness in the chain was not philosophy, not doctrine, not the humans who refused to be hurried, not even the satellites watching the curve of the planet. The weakness was a sliver of silicon, an integrated circuit, an interface chip whose unit cost at the time could be rounded to the price of a stamp. 46 cents on a procurement sheet. A line item so small you could lose it under a coffee cup. A creature of logic, gates, and fatigue, sitting in the place where streams of information join, dropping the wrong character into the wrong slot and turning a summary into a siren. NBUT, the watch officer, doesn't know that yet. He only knows that he kept a gate closed until the Earth raised its hand to vote. NHE goes home when the sun is a rumor behind the Front Range. He sits at a kitchen table that has never cared about acronyms and drinks coffee that forgot what urgency tastes like. He doesn't tell his wife what nearly happened, because nearly is not a word that fits easily into the mouth. He sleeps for 3 hours and dreams of numbers standing in line politely and then getting back on their bus. At shift change, the relief team reads the log and asks mundane questions. Which printer jammed? Who called whom? Whether the coffee machine is going to be replaced before the next comet. Whether anyone got a solid answer from Greenland about that small antenna hiccup they're always promising to fix. The mundanity is the point. Rooms like this survive by being boring on purpose. In the days that follow, analysts sit under fluorescent lights as honest as winter, and they start wearing grooves in paper. They track message paths. They compare times. They look at the software that digests the satellite reports and the software that formats the warnings for human eyes. They interview the radar sites and record the exact second each station said no. They draw flowcharts that look like nervous systems. Somewhere in a stack of schematics, near a box labeled interface and a bus labeled display, there is a part number. It costs less than a slice of pie. It is about to become famous against its will. NTHE engineers know that every machine has a personality, the way every instrument in an orchestra has a tone, even when it plays the same note. They know that batches of chips can be temperamental. They know that the real world finds corners in logic we thought were rounded. And they know that when a chain of systems almost recruits a nation to do something irreversible, the place to look first is always the point where translation happens, the place where one machine's language becomes another machine's summary. And inside the Pentagon, the lesson from Cheyenne Mountain starts to turn into sentences. Dual confirmation is not just good policy, it is law. No escalation without ground truth. The latter remains. Space sees, Earth sees, humans decide. The humans, authority to slow the latter, is not a courtesy, it is a requirement. These words are not written in blood. They are written in pencil, like all living doctrine, but this time the pencil presses hard enough to leave an impression on the page underneath. Pilots joked blackly in ready rooms about being halfway into flight suits and being told to sit back down. Radar techs talk shop about fan coverage and tell the same story to 3 different audiences, changing nothing each time because the point of the story is that nothing happened. The Canadians make coffee the way only Canadians can when they have almost participated in the end of the world and did not. People sleep a little worse for a week and then return to the ordinary insomnia reserved for mortgage payments and slow leaks. And then, 3 days later, on June 6th, before the coffee in the mountain has a chance to become background again, the numbers wake up. Another alarm, another insistence, another integrated summary that smells like panic. The crews feel the familiar prickling on the backs of their necks, the way you can feel static before lightning. The watch officer on duty this time has already been briefed on what happened on the 3rd. He knows the radars earned the right to be believed first. He knows to ask Earth before he lets space write poetry again. They run the same ladder. They get the same answers. Space says yes, Earth says no. Humans decide to wait. And again, the world chooses to stay. This time, the analysis team moves faster. They pull the log sooner. They point more fingers into the wiring harness. They begin to talk less about policy and more about solder. They find a place in the chain where a stream of characters is supposed to flow like a calm river. Digits, flags, identifiers, joining from different sources and formatting into the summary that ends up on the watch officer's screen. And in that river, a particular chip is counting a beat off the music. Not always, not predictably, just enough to drop the wrong digit into a slot where it doesn't belong, to turn a 0 into a 9, to turn a single detection into many, to turn a mistaken ember into a described wildfire, and 46 cents. That's the number that attaches to the part, not because it matters economically, but because it is obscene to think a sliver of silicon cheaper than a stamp could recruit 5,000 airmen and a nation's heartbeat. That obscenity is what makes the phrase travel. The story grows an easy villain, a cheap chip that almost bought an apocalypse. NBUT. The men in the bunker do not get to hate a chip. They get to write revisions. They get to add a rule that the integrated summary is never a primary voice. They get to insist in writing that no matter how many red characters bloom on a screen, nothing, no scramble, no DEFCON shift, no coded phrase that wakes engines, happens unless the Earth throws a plot on a scope. The Earth gets the last word. The sky can lie. The curve does not. NTHE watch officer from the 3rd is asked to give a short talk to a room where the chairs are arranged too neatly. He uses the same nouns he used that night. He refuses adjectives. He says, "We held for dual confirmation. The radars did not corroborate. We withheld notification." The room writes it down as if they have never heard the word withheld used proudly. He does not talk about the feeling, how the integrated display looked more like a mood than a map, how the numbers grew in a way that didn't feel like doctrine. He keeps that part for himself because he is allergic to intuition in public. In private, he admits that sometimes your skin knows when math is misbehaving. And at home, he opens a drawer and takes out a pencil. Not a ceremonial one, a hardware store special with a red coat and a smell like childhood. He writes 3 words on an index card and slides it under a rubber band on the inside cover of his notebook. Humans decide. It is corny. It is true. It is the sentence that let a room full of adults share oxygen with calm. Cheyenne Mountain returns to its rhythm. Rotations end. New shifts arrive. The fluorescent lights keep erasing shadows and failing to erase doubt. The humming consoles wait for the next verb. The phones wait on their felt cradles, heavier than law. The air keeps tasting like coins. NTHE cheap chip is swapped. Its cousins are hunted and replaced. Someone changes the procurement spec, so future chips have to prove they are not moody. Someone adds a paragraph to training that forces crews to sit on their hands while a narrator tells them that the sky is on fire. Someone writes a checklist line that says, aloud, that human beings are allowed to make time go slower when time is trying to sprint. And across the arc of that week in 1980, the United States relearns a lesson it claims it always knew. Speed is not a virtue by itself. In a system built to be fast, the most valuable component is the pause that lets truth catch up. This is where Part 1 ends, with the pause still holding, with the world still intact, with pencils doing as much work as satellites. In Part 2, we walk through the autopsy, how the communications path was wired, where the interface logic sat, How a 46-cent integrated circuit managed to drop the wrong digits into the warning summary. Why the alarm repeated 3 days later. What was changed in code, in hardware, and in doctrine, and where the artifacts of the night, logs, memos, and that disgraced part number ended up. NFOR now, hold this picture in your head. A room under a mountain where nothing happened, and then a ladder of 3 steps, space, earth, humans, and a 4th step that isn't on any diagram but lives in a chair. The human gate that refuses to be hurried. Humans decide. Tonight, humans did. And a line of red text that could have written history was demoted to paper, clipped into a ribbon, and filed under a word that looks unimpressive on a tab. Incident. NTHE, ink dried. The building yawned. Dawn turned the mountains into silhouettes that did not know how close they came to being less than silhouettes. Somewhere, a pilot unzipped his flight suit and laughed at a joke that wasn't funny yesterday. Somewhere, a radar tech wiped down a console with a rag that smelled like solvent and pride. Somewhere, a procurement officer circled a part number and swore, quietly, to make 46 cents feel heavier next time. And in the mountain, the watch officer picked up his coffee, tasted the coins again, and decided the taste was ordinary. He was grateful to be bored. He hoped to be bored again tomorrow. He planned to be. He planned to make it so morning, then meetings. A conference room with chairs that tried to be comfortable and failed. A whiteboard, already tired of being erased. Uniforms, ties, notebooks, and a box of pastries. No one felt like eating. The briefers spoke the language of after, timelines, cross-checks, and the kind of calm that sounds like glue drying. NTHE room agreed on what had not happened. No launches, no radar tracks, no need to move the nation's posture. The room then did what rooms like this are built to do. It went looking for the seam. Somewhere, an assumption had shaken. Somewhere, a handoff had slurred. Somewhere, a machine that spoke numbers had told a ghost story. NTHE first pass was doctrinal, because doctrine is the skeleton. Dual confirmation was intact. No one had skipped a rung. Space had claimed birth. Earth had refused to agree. Humans had decided in favor of the curve. That spine held. Good. On to plumbing. And plumbing, in this world, means wires, buses, buffers, and the small tyrannies of old code. The early warning system is not one machine. It is a congregation of them, negotiated into harmony. Satellites stare at the limb of the Earth and watch for the hot edge of a rocket's roar. Giant radars shoulder into the sky and wait for hard things to skim above the horizon. Data rides lines, gets chewed into formats, and appears on displays that are supposed to make urgency legible. Somewhere in those translations, a syllable had turned into a shout. Cheyenne Mountain provided its logs, fat with times, and tidy with handwriting. The National Military Command Center sent over the exact second its phones woke up. Strategic Air Command reported when ladders rolled and when hands stopped on buckles. The northern radar sites sent their own careful negatives, each line stamped with a confidence born of seeing a lot of nothing correctly. And then the engineers arrived, crisp sleeves and exact adjectives. They did not start with cosmology or cellophane-thin clouds. They started with the map of which box talks to which box. The display processor that assembles the tactical warning and attack assessment summary, those are the bureaucratic words for the red lines that make your stomach taste like pennies, sits downstream of the feeds. That processor is a middle manager. It reads, collates, formats, and announces. It is supposed to be boring. On a very small board inside that manager, someone pointed to a part number so cheap you could tuck the invoice in a tip jar and no one would object. An interface chip. A tiny translator that turned the arriving characters into the message the display could swallow. There was a murmur. Not of blame, of recognition. Anyone who has ever babysat an orchestra of machines knows the truth that the brochures never print. Translation is where mistakes go to breed. Still, you do not hang an incident on a hunch about a chip. You prove it like math. The test benches came out. An identical board was set up in a lab with the kind of fluorescent light that makes even Triumph look pale. They ran recorded data through the chain and watched the summary line spit back its verdicts. Once, twice, 10 times, all as designed. Then, without warning, a digit at the chip's mouth flipped. Not a clean, obvious error with smoke and drama. A stumble. A single bit deciding to be the other bit, for a fraction long enough to be read. The chip resumed its manners immediately after, the way a person might cough and pretend he hadn't. What looked like many launches was, in this interpretation, a single dropped stitch that then got sewn into the whole sweater. The summary accepted the corrupted character, declared abundance, and scrolled it like a headline. The rest of the system wasn't lying, it was repeating. The satellites had done what they always do, watch heat. The radars had done what they always do, trust the horizon. The offender sat in the space between feeds and fonts, in 46 cents. That was the procurement cost of the part in that era. The number traveled because it made a delicious and outrageous headline, the store brand apocalypse. But the engineers grimaced at that simplification. Yes, the chip was cheap. No, the problem was not price alone. The problem was architecture. The system had let a single hiccup propagate into authority. That is not a budget issue. That is a design sin. Cheyenne Mountain, proud even when embarrassed, revealed that the room had not believed the scream. That was the good news. The bad news was that a scream had been easy to compose. If the watch team had been lazier, or the timing worse, if politics had angled differently, if a second chair with less caution had been sitting at the wrong console, that scream could have kicked off a ritual of posture and counterposture that feels logical to planners and looks insane to civilians. 3 days later, June 6th, the Mountain got a second rehearsal. In came the red lines. In came the integers that wanted to be believed. This time, the radars were already on the balls of their feet. Negative again. The display, fed by the same class of chip, painted panic again. The watch officer respected space and waited for Earth and used verbs like withhold and maintain instead of escalate. The pause won again. NBY then, the hunt had heat. The lab fried a twin chip with a heat gun, cooled it with a fan, and found the temperature drift made the stumble more likely. They sprayed it with a can that made metal shiver and watched the output tremble. They flexed the board once and saw the checksum glitch as if a solder joint had aged poorly and decided loyalty was optional. None of it was theatrical. There were no sparks. There was no smell of martyrdom. Just a quiet, statistically rude device that sometimes dropped a character into a slot where meaning had been waiting. The Mountain swapped the offender and its siblings. Supply ran audits, then ordered a broader purge. Procurement officers who had lived their careers in the shadow of price learned the tone of failure, and some of them began to think like artists, pick by performance, not just by cost. A memo went up the chain recommending that the warning summary be de-idolized. The red line would no longer be a primary anything. It would be a thing to be argued with. The nation would accept an extra beat in exchange for an extra layer of sanity. There was a quieter change too. A sentence grew teeth. Dual confirmation had always lived in doctrine, solid enough to teach and soft enough to ignore under pressure. Now it became a switch you could not bypass without a human signature that would be read by an investigator under a bright light. The switch sat between space and command. A human sat on top of it. And after action called that human the gatekeeper. The human called himself on shift. And outside the Mountain, the world remained moody. A year earlier, a training tape had gotten loose in the bloodstream like a lab virus, and for a few minutes on a November morning, displays had said war with the same confidence they bring to weather. That piece of history gave this week its echo. People who weren't in the loop mashed those incidents into one and misremembered them as drama. The men and women in the rooms where verbs mattered did not. They remembered the taste of cold coffee and the polite voices of radars saying negative, and the feeling of telling a phone in Washington that they were not going to hurry a decision just because a screen liked the color red. Inside the Pentagon, a meeting with fewer pastries produced a list that could outlive adrenaline. First, refactor the message path so that a single faulty character can never promote itself into a national headline. Parity checks everywhere. Checksums everywhere. If a bit sneezes, make it cough again before you count it. Second, require the satellite and radar chains to converge before any label above routine can be spoken on a phone that matters. Third, change training. Give crews the exact scenario that bent the week. Space yells, Earth is quiet. The summary writes poetry. Force them to wait through the silence until the radars can finally speak in their geometric accent. Fourth, change culture. Reward caution loud enough that, the next time someone with a heavy handset and a light stomach says withhold, he feels a hand on his back, not a breath on his neck. NTHE watch officer from the 3rd and the team from the 6th briefed, then slept, then briefed again. Neither turned their experience into a sermon. They were allergic to sermons. They stuck to times. 2:26, 2:39, 2:41. They stuck to verbs. Validate. Cross-check. Withhold. Maintain. They stuck to nouns. Radars. Satellites. Summary. Chip. Their restraint made the rooms trust them more, not less. NHE was asked, once, what it felt like in the minute between the satellite's certainty and the radar's permission to disagree. He took a sip of water that tasted like a pipe and said it felt like holding your breath, politely. The room smiled, then stopped, because the metaphor was too kind. It wasn't breath. It was a country sitting on the edge of its chair and deciding not to stand up until the lights came on. Somewhere in a depot, a cardboard box full of replaced chips sat on a shelf above a broom. No one labeled it cursed. Someone wrote, failed batch, date, and an arrow pointing to a part number that would later anchor 1,000 internet stories and a handful of careful books. 46 cents became a phrase with an aftertaste. The technicians who had tweaked solder and logged temperatures rolled their eyes every time a reporter called Cost the villain. They would have preferred a smarter villain. Cost, after all, wasn't the one that almost recruited the world. Trust was. Trust in a single river of characters. Trust in a cleanly formatted headline. Trust, unexamined, is an expensive mistake. When June gave way to July, the mountain remembered how to be ordinary. That's the ambition in a building like this. Monotony so thick you can slice it. The watch officer took his coffee without sugar and added stubbornness instead. New lieutenants arrived and learned to ask Earth for permission before they let space scare them. The radars kept spinning music you can't hear unless you care, and the satellites kept staring at the edge of the world where rockets try to look like stars. And then, in the autumn, a different rehearsal, the kind named after paperwork, wound up the net. An exercise in Europe ran hotter than usual, or maybe it only seemed that way because nerves had forgotten the right temperature. The watch officer was not on duty. He was at home, making a sandwich that was more bread than meat, when his phone rang with the kind of politeness that means answer now. He listened to the voice from the mountain, then to another voice from another room, and then he sat down in a chair that had never been in the military and waited for the call to end. NHE thought about how fragile a ladder can be when it's pulled tight. He thought about how many times in a year human beings are asked to be better than diagrams. He thought about the memory of red numerals pretending to be fact, and about the power of a single phrase set into a circuit, withhold notification pending dual confirmation. He wrote those words on scrap paper beside the phone a second time, as if his hand wanted to memorize them. When he threw the paper away later, he did it like a small ceremony. Fold, 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 so the words had to work harder to get back into the air. At work the next day, someone asked him if he knew yet which chip had misbehaved on the 6th. He did not snap back that a chip is not a person, and misbehaving is not a word for silicon. He said, we're fixing the chain, not hunting a mascot. The comment earned a slow nod from a chief who had learned, over the years, to distinguish between stories that helped and stories that only sounded good when you were far away from consoles. NTHE Fix, when it arrived, was not dramatic. It lived in software and in small boards. It lived in lines of code that said "wait" in a dozen clever ways. It lived in the decision to relegate the summary display to a chorus rather than a soloist. It lived in giving ground radars permission to be the adults in the room when the sky was in a mood. And it lived in training that humiliated impatience. In that training, instructors invented a cruel hour. They fed the crews a picture that made satellites sing and made the summary throw confetti. They kept the radars blind for exactly as long as the Earth demands. They watched the watch teams argue with their own blood pressure, and they measured posture in verbs. If anyone jumped a step, the instructor stopped the clock, took a deep breath, and made the room start from the top with a new cup of bad coffee and worse lighting. The lesson landed. You are not paid to be fast. You are paid to be right at speed. Meanwhile, the engineers sent out a final report in prose that wore a necktie. Root cause: intermittent failure in an interface integrated circuit within the warning message processor, causing occasional character corruption in the tactical warning and attack assessment summary. Contributing factors: insufficient input validation, limited parity checking on specific fields, procedural overweighting of summary display. Corrective actions: hardware replacement, input sanitation, parity and checksum reinforcement, procedural emphasis on cross-sensor corroboration, training updates. The report did not mention fear. It did not discuss the silence between systems. It did not try metaphor. It left that for other rooms. Asked by a friend what he learned that June, the watch officer, said this, that sometimes a miracle is really a habit. The habit was boring. Call who needs calling. Ask the question you're tired of asking. Trust the radar more than the rumor. And write sentences that read the same at 3 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. He did not say hero. He did not say near miss. He did not even say chip. He said habit, because habit is what you can scale. Years later, he would hold a training pamphlet in his hands and see the phrase "human in the loop" printed in a box on a ladder that future officers would memorize. He would notice the box had moved from the margin of footnotes to the middle of the diagram, like a heart transplant that finally found its chest. He would smile in the way that only paperwork can make a person smile. Small, satisfied, private. NHE kept one artifact from that week. Not a memo, not a chip, a pencil. Standard, red-coated, cheap. He kept it in the drawer beside his stove, where it lived next to a tape measure, 3 rubber bands, and a stack of shopping lists. Sometimes when picking it up to write milk, he would turn it over and remember that there had been a morning when a pencil kept pace with satellites and won. Some of the men who sat that week under the mountain left the service and learned the strange piece of selling insurance or teaching geometry. Some stayed and mentored people who were new to rooms without windows. One of them liked to tell young officers that the most valuable skill in the bunker was not pressing a button. It was pronouncing no without apology. He would say the trick is to make no sound like a shield, not a fear. And a few journalists later came sniffing. They loved the 46 cents. They loved the image of a stamp-priced apocalypse. The watch officer declined to play hero and declined to play villain. He said the chip failed like a knee sometimes fails when you stand too fast after kneeling. He said the system learned to put a hand on the table before it stood up. The journalists dutifully wrote that down, and then, when the story was laid out for print, the headline inevitably found its way back to the price of a part. So it goes. Headlines love villains they can buy for less than lunch. There was a quieter headline, but it never made ink. It lived in the memory of the crews and in the muscle memory of hands that now hovered a hair longer over phones. It read, "People outrank summaries." It read, "Geometry outranks adrenaline." It read, "A country can decide to take one more breath before it decides what to do with its hands." NIF, you ask what happened to the failed pieces. The answer is not poetic. Some were cataloged and boxed in a lab with a number that means nothing to anyone who doesn't invoice for a living. One went into a training kit as a lesson with edges. A note in neat handwriting warned the student, "Do not trust neat handwriting." Another sat on a desk for a while like a trophy for winning a game no one applauds. Then it went where old parts go, to a shelf, to a bin, to a story. If you ask what happened to the words, that answer is better. They got heavier. Withhold, maintain, validate. Cross-check. In a world that values immediate, those words learned to throw their weight around. And in the mountain, they were spoken more often, and in more confident tones, by people who had heard the difference between sound and signal and chosen a side. There is a habit in military history to find the moment that changed everything and put it under theatrical light. June of 1980 resists that treatment. It is not a photograph of a handshake or a bridge. It is an hour of choosing not to hurry. It is an autopsy that blames design, not drama. It is an agreement between people who cannot afford to be romantic, that they will add friction to important decisions and call that friction wisdom. NBY, the time the leaves around Colorado Springs turned brown at the edges, the mountain had processed the lessons into laminate. A slim card joined the stack at every console. It said in a few lines, "Satellite indications do not constitute independent basis for notification or posture change. Ground-based corroboration required. Anomalies suspected if sequence of events inconsistent with expected attack profiles. Report with nouns. Annotate rationale." The card was boring. It was supposed to be. Boring cards build boring nights. Boring nights keep children asleep. NTHE watch officer found himself, months later, in a classroom too bright for his taste, facing young faces that had not yet argued with a screen. He told them the story without trying to be moving. He told them it begins with a color and ends with a pencil. He told them that the most patriotic thing he did that week was refuse to be impressed by a summary. He told them that if they ever find themselves with a heavy phone in one hand and a light stomach in the other, they should ask Earth for permission before they let space take a victory lap. NHE resisted the urge to mention the taste of coins. He resisted the urge to dramatize the clock. He resisted the urge to call out the name of a chip as if it were a person. He stuck to verbs and nouns, to the things rooms can live on when sleep is thin and the air never changes temperature. One of the students asked what would have happened if the radars had confirmed. He said, "Then we would have climbed the ladder and used different words and hoped the world turned out to be as rational as our procedures say it is." Another asked how sure he had felt. He said, "Certainty is a flavor you should distrust in this line of work." He said he trusts patterns and physics and the silence of a scope over the enthusiasm of a headline. Another student, braver, asked if he had been scared. He said he had been very busy, which is what a professional says when he means yes. At home, late one night, he took out the pencil and rolled it between his fingers. He thought about the week the world had been an eggshell and about the ordinary things that kept it from cracking. The reluctance of geometry to hurry, the proof of radars, the alphabetical courage of a laminated card, the humility of a human being who understands that not acting is sometimes the action. NHE wrote 3 lines on a sheet that would end up under magnets on a refrigerator door. First line, people decide. Second line, wait for the curve. Third line, don't let a summary tell your heart what to do. He left the sheet there among grocery lists and a child's drawing of a house with too many windows, and he went to bed. Before he slept, he tried to count missiles the way some people count sheep and discovered that what calmed him was counting radars instead. In later years, when the story of the 46-cent chip surfaced at conferences and in essays, the immediate questions were always small and appetizing. What kind of chip exactly? Which board? Which bench? The better question, the one he wished people would tattoo on the inside of their eyelids, was about design. Why did the system allow one rude bit to costume itself as authority? Why do humans build clean lines of trust and then act surprised when a single knot slips? The answers are boring again. Because budgets. Because legacy systems. Because no one wants to be the manager who asks for money to make things slower. NBUT, the fix stayed. The slower bit, the friction point, the gate with a person's name printed above it. That stayed. And in the mountain, and in other rooms like it, the culture began to talk about the virtue of boring out loud. Boring was not an insult. Boring was a survival skill. Boring was a medal you earned by leaving drama hungry. NIF. You strip the badges and jargon from that week. The picture is simple. A machine lied. Another machine told the truth. A person chose the truthful machine and the truthful machine's schedule. The cost of the lying was 46 cents. The value of the choosing was beyond arithmetic. You cannot invoice for a morning that did not become smoke. You cannot pay a crew in the currency of what never happened. You can keep their coffee cups full. You can let them keep their habit. And so the watch officer kept his. Coffee. Coins. Cards. Calls. Wait. Decide. Write it down. In the mountain, the air remained the same temperature. The ceiling remained low. The world continued to walk its orbit like a tightrope. And beneath that wire, in rooms without windows, people kept their balance with pencils. Years passed, and the headlines found other storms to name. The mountain stayed, unphotogenic and faithful, a ribcage around instruments that prefer the dark. Crews rotated. The coffee never improved. The air kept the same heavy temperature no one could describe, only endure. If you asked any of them what they did, they would say they watched. If you asked why that mattered, they would say that watching is not the opposite of doing. Watching is how you decide what deserves a verb. NTHE small changes stuck. The summary display learned humility. The radars learned to be listened to first. The satellites learned they were not the only eyes in the family. The interface chips learned to earn their place with checks and doubles and rails that kept one stumble from turning into a stampede. There were more boxes in the diagrams and more arrows, and the arrows had to pass through a new square with a quiet label, Human Gate. It did not make the posters. It made the difference. People outside called it bureaucracy and rolled their eyes. People inside called it friction and slept better. The watch officer, who had once tasted copper and chosen to wait, watched with a veteran's half-smile as the next generation learned to be proud of boring. He sat in back rows of classrooms while lieutenants practiced saying withhold and maintain and validate with voices that made those verbs sound like shields. He signed fewer incident reports because there were fewer incidents. He signed more training forms because there were more students. It felt like interest paid on a debt the world didn't know it owed. NHE kept the pencil in the kitchen drawer. He moved houses twice, one apartment to a smaller one, then to a place with a window you could open without a wrench. The pencil came with him both times, wrapped in a rubber band with a tape measure, like a marriage of the useful. Every so often, he would run his thumbnail along the lacquer and watch the little curl rise. And he would imagine that somewhere a satellite was looking sideways at the edge of the Earth, and a radar was counting the seconds until a curve surrendered a truth. One afternoon, he met a former colleague for coffee, the kind you drink to be polite. They spoke in the shorthand of people who had been bored together professionally. Do you remember the night, the first one or the second? The second, with the heat wave and that lab bench. I remember the fan. I remember the watch floor being so quiet you could hear paper decide what shape it wanted to be. They said chip only once and grimaced at their own laziness. It wasn't a chip, one of them said. It was a path. The other agreed. A path with a weakness that thought it was a shortcut. They laughed, softly, because laughing is the sound you make when you don't want to sanctify a near miss. Near the end of his last tour, he stood alone on the watch floor and counted the hums. The racks had their notes, the ventilation its lower drone, the clock a faint proper tick. The fluorescent lights, that insect whine that never commits to being a sound, only an irritation. He counted them the way you count breathing in a waiting room. He thought about how many times in a lifetime you are asked to believe your eyes when your eyes have been fed by machines, and he felt the old gratitude for physics. Physics is slow, he thought. Slow as a mercy. His last shift ended at 7 on a morning that had the decency to be ordinary. He signed the log, neat block letters, the way you touch a forehead in a blessing. He handed the chair to someone who knew exactly where to put the cup so it wouldn't spill if the fan hiccuped. He walked the corridor with his hands at his sides. He avoided the urge to touch the wall, because you do not make symbols out of concrete. It has enough work. He stepped outside and felt the air move against the inside of his lungs in a way the bunker never allowed. There was a flag somewhere nearby that made a noise like paper and wind. He stopped to listen to it for longer than the gesture deserved, which is how you say thank you when you don't want to make it about you. Retirement felt like an unissued order. He woke at the same hour for months, looked at the kitchen clock that didn't tick as confidently, and made coffee that tasted like copper out of habit, not necessity. He read, he taught, occasionally, he answered questions from people who wanted a war story and were disappointed to get a discipline story instead. He kept giving them the discipline story anyway. You save fewer lives with romance. Sometimes he walked by a schoolyard and listened to children invent rules. The rules grew wild and then precise. No, you have to count to 10 before you can chase. No, you can't run until the other team yells ready. He smiled because that was the kernel of the thing, hidden in chalk and skinned knees. Wait for the count. Agree on the ladder. Don't let speed become a brag. Once, a young reporter with too much caffeine in his eyes asked him if it bothered him that the great near war would always be known by the price of a component. He said no. He said prices make it easy for people to talk about something they would rather not feel. If a number lets you glance at it without flinching, use the number. Then go home and look at your child asleep and be grateful that in a room without windows, someone chose to be unimpressed by a summary. NHE was invited to a ceremony he did not want. He went because people he respected would be there. The speeches were good as speeches go, measured, careful with blame, generous with credit to teams. He stood at the back and counted exits and marveled at how loud public gratitude can be. When someone asked him to say something, he said, "Thank you," and stepped away. No point handing the room a paragraph that would only be quoted for its shortest sentence. At home that night, the pencil went back in the drawer. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote a list for the next day that included the usual things: milk, bread, oil for the squeaky door. He added 3 more items and underlined them, as if he were addressing a crew. Call who needs calling. Wait for the curve. Write it down. He tucked the list under a magnet, shaped like a rocket, that a grandchild had stuck there months before. He didn't move the rocket. He liked the joke too much. When he did talk, in small rooms where chairs scraped and the projector never worked on the first try, he ended with the same line: "The miracle you wanted is just a habit you practiced. The habit is this: do not let the hottest part of the signal choose your verbs. Ask the dumb question again: does the earth agree? If it does, act. If it doesn't, wait and write." He would smile, a little apologetically, as if he had brought an unglamorous gift to a party. Then he would open the floor and hope someone asked about design instead of drama. In the mountain, years after his last watch ended, a new recruit sat where he had sat and learned the choreographed boredom of readiness. The recruit drank coffee that tasted better. Machines improve even when they shouldn't. And read the laminated card with the tiny print in the box that said "Human Gate." On a night no one will remember, a display flickered and suggested a story. The recruit looked at the other display and saw it was not a story yet. The recruit waited for the curve. The room breathed. Someone wrote a time in a log. The world continued, unimpressed by the chance it had just taken. That is how you want it to be, a miracle that doesn't know it is one. Then the failed parts that once wore blame, they became teaching tools. A board with a scar, a chip with a human explanation taped to it, a recording of a bench test in which a digit changed its mind for half a breath, and a lab full of serious people took that breath and made a new rule out of it. The relics never learned to glow. They didn't need to. Their use was practical. The glow lived instead in the hands that learned to hesitate in the right place. And He grew older. He forgot names and remembered procedures. He misplaced his keys and could still recite a checklist. He walked slower, but his sentences stayed upright, balanced around nouns like radars and verbs like verify. He watched the news the way a mason looks at a wall, checking for cracks no one else can see. When anniversaries rolled around and someone called to ask how close everyone had come, he said, "Close enough to matter, far enough to learn." It was not evasive. It was a measurement in a unit only rooms without windows know how to use. Near the end, a granddaughter found the pencil and asked if she could have it for school. He said yes immediately. He wanted it to be used for grocery lists and spelling tests, not placed behind glass. She asked if it was important. He said it had been near something important once and learned to behave. She nodded solemnly, in the way children nod when they understand less than half and accept the rest. She sharpened it down to a stub and wrote her name so many times the letters stopped looking like letters and started looking like small fences. He thought that was fitting. Fences keep things from running when they shouldn't. Last time he spoke in public, a small auditorium with buzzing lights and a microphone that hummed like a fly, he ended where he had always wanted to end. He said, "Systems watch, people decide." He let the sentence stand there, unaccompanied. He did not decorate it with a story. He did not salute it with a metaphor. He gathered his papers, none of which a chip could have read, and stepped down without waiting for applause to arrange itself. When he was gone, the rooms remained. They always do. The mountain kept its posture. The radars kept their arcs. The satellites kept their silent stare at the place where rockets pretend to be stars. And the people, new and careful, sat in chairs warmed by habit and kept a nation within its lanes by saying no to hurry and yes to geometry. A few of them kept pencils in drawers where they could be reached with one hand. A few left notes on refrigerators that said call, wait, write, as if they were commanding kitchens. World did not end. That was the point. The world preferred not to notice the shift of a finger from one phone to the other. The world preferred not to know that someone had waited for the curve and found it faithful. The world rewarded those people in the only currency they wanted: another shift to work through, another morning to walk into, another night in which 5 becomes a rumor and stays that way. NSO. If you ever find yourself in a room without windows, listening to machines that speak in green and red, remember the habit that turned a price tag into a footnote. Ask the question that makes speed earn its keep. Let the earth decide what the sky is trying to sell you. And when the moment passes, and it will if you let it, write it down in the smallest, steadiest hand you can manage. World continues to walk its orbit like a tightrope. Beneath that wire, in rooms without windows, people keep their balance with pencils. And the miracle is not that they catch the world when it slips. The miracle is that most nights they teach it not to slip at all.